have people show up at their door and do things, but none of them have been harmed. Not yet, ever. Because I won't say more than the fact that there are people backstopping us who would know that happened, and those whoever did it would be grabbed up and arrested or eliminated. But it's a little bit spooky, but I don't want to go much more into that. But yes, I think people over the years, now some of those I think are just coincidental, but people like General McCaslin, who had been very involved in some very dark projects at Wright-Patterson. He was the one who kind of gaslit Tom DeLonge, along with Luis Elizondo, with that through the Stars Academy, and there was all kinds of manipulation and disinformation provided out through that vector, out through that system. We know this. We also know that in that there was law enforcement looking at the Wright-Patterson complex and actions out of there. And the question in my mind is, did General McCaslin disappear himself because there were things closing in on him? Now, some of the other ones, like the Amy Estridge and others, very suspicious. And that is, if you look at the documentary released about 3 years ago called The Lost Century, you can see it on Tubi for free, or Amazon Prime or wherever. We document that over the decades, there have been many of these technology people, brilliant scientists who have been killed, disappeared, imprisoned, et cetera, and so on. And of course, we've always pointed out that the only reason we're still in the Middle East and now fighting with Iran over the Straits of Hormuz is because we're dependent on oil. But the inventions that these brilliant scientists have come up with would completely replace all the oil, gas, coal, nuclear power, et cetera, in the world. And I think that is the crux of the problem. You're looking at a massive amount of geopolitical power at stake with disclosure, somewhere between 1,000 trillion and 2,000 trillion dollars in assets that would, over the course of 20 years, become redundant and unnecessary, which means they have no value. And I think for that, people will kill. For that, people will do criminal activity. For that, organizations have developed over the last 80 years to be sure that it never sees the light of day in those people's lifetime. But of course, this has led us to the situation we're in now, where it's endless war in the Middle East over oil. And a planet, Earth Day is here in April, is in trouble. And half the world's population is in unimaginable poverty. And 3 billion people on the planet out of 8 billion don't even have fuel to cook their food. Most people don't know that. So this is not a sustainable situation. And these ET visitors know that. One of their key messages is you need to make peace with each other and bring out these technologies and save this beautiful planet. That is a key part of the ET message. We know this because my group has had direct contact with them over the years through the CE5 contact initiative. So I think that one of the big problems is that the magnitude of this issue is so huge that no one wants to deal with it. They want to go, let's kick the can down the road to the next president or the next Senate or the next, head of state in Europe or whatever it is. And I've had that said to me. I remember right after we did the National Press Club event in 2001, I met with this old guy who was a consigliere of George W. Bush, the president at that time. And he said, look, once you get into the White House, all these guys are going to govern in a way that doesn't rock the boat too much because it's too much for them to manage. And that is part of the inertia of the secrecy. And it reminds me of being out on the Rockefeller ranch on the deck late at night with Lawrence Rockefeller in 1993 in September. And he didn't know that I was about to brief President Clinton as CI director on all this. And he said, the consequences of this coming out are so vast and so profound that no aspect of life on Earth will be unchanged by it. I said, yes, Lawrence, that's why it's so extremely secret. It isn't secret because it's little green or gray men. It's because the implications are so huge. But the more we kick the can down the road, the worse the state of humanity is, the worse the state of the Earth is. And so we just have to come together and find an intelligent way to make this happen, and then gradually bring out these technologies, so it's not too disruptive, but fixes the problem, the underlying problem that's structural of how we live on this planet. We're living on the planet with late 1800s technologies. That's 80 years old. So all the other technologies that have been invented have disappeared. And so when you come across someone like Amy Estridge, these other people who have these breakthroughs, because here's the thing, the laws of the universe are, by definition, universal. Contrary to what the Vice President J.D. Vance said, where it's supernatural and it's demons, which is, of course, absurd, an idea that's so untutored that it beggars the imagination. But, sorry, Mr. Vance, this is completely bonkers. But here's the thing, is that those technologies are a threat to the status quo of power. And we're not talking about the politicians who don't know much about this. We're talking about the real power, macroeconomic power. And that's where it comes from, because, the U.S. federal discretionary budget are a couple $1 trillion. We're talking about 1,000 trillion here, right, or more. So you can put that on a scale and see which wins. And of course, Eisenhower warned about this, at the military industrial, an operative word, the industrial corporate end of that complex would become a threat to our security and our democracy and to, in fact, our country. Now, he said that because he knew it had already happened, by the way, that he had already been pushed aside. Now, the ETs at that time, around 1954, wanted to have all the countries disarm away from nuclear, bring these other technologies out, make peace, have contact with them. And that was a year before I was born. I was born in 1955. So in June, I'll be 71. So that's how long, the whole time I've been on Earth, we haven't needed to have the world look like this, right? And so it's kind of sad and poignant, but you think, well, it's time for us to move on and, at least catch up with what the world should have been 70 years ago, had this not gone off the rails, and had there not been these corrupting powers and influence. But yeah, so now in terms of all the people being named in this missing scientists and stuff, I think some of them, it may be coincidental. I don't know. But some of them most certainly were related to this subject, and it looks suspicious. We have brought this over to some people in law enforcement and some former military investigators on our team to look into. But again, I want to emphasize, I didn't have none of those people were directly involved with myself or the Disclosure Project or my investigators who are in the military and national security circles.
I'm sure you've also heard of the recent unfortunate death of David Wilcock, which is yes, being ruled a suicide. Yes. But of course, rumors swirl online, about that, saying sure, that, I know him personally and he would have never done that. Like, I've seen things like that circulating. But regardless, when things like this happen, do you feel like it deters whistleblowers from coming forward? Like, every time there's, a new figure, something happens to somebody, it's kind of like it scares people. Do you feel that that's to be the case?
Well, I wonder if the large amount of coverage, not on David's situation, but on these other missing people, is being done to do that. It's sort of to throw cold water on people coming forward, of sort of indirectly threatening people, right? Or discouraging people. Now, so far, our people who are coming on May 8th to Washington at the National Press Club have not been deterred. But you can imagine that could be scary to someone who is, let's say, more essential to operations currently, right? Which these people coming forward aren't. Mm-hmm. And I think that could be part of that strategy. But I don't think it should. Now, in terms of David, he learned about this subject, by the way, at the original National Press Club event in 2001. He was there. I vaguely remember meeting him, and he was there. We had a little conference afterwards also, like we're having this time. Mm-hmm. And I remember he was there, and he was a young man. And we met. And so that inspired him to go forward with his career from that event. And it is sad that what has happened. I don't have any information. I knew he was having some personal problems and some intense things going on, the nature of which I don't know. I don't see there's any indication that there was anything conspiratorial or dark about what happened. It's just something very sad and, and tragic, and our thoughts and, see him in the worlds of light and, going on. But I don't have any information more than what you probably have, except, I did know him somewhat, but not that well. And it's certainly a great tragedy.
Yeah, definitely very tragic news. I want to circle back to the mandates that President Trump has put forth and ask you, I mean, if you can say anything about President Trump, it's that he hasn't seemed to be afraid to rock the boat. So it's not difficult for many people to imagine him being the president to, kind of put the stamp on disclosure, so to speak. But do they actually have access to anything that could surprise us? Like you mentioned that they probably have very limited access to all of the available documents. So they'll release what they have, but it may not be anything earth-shattering. Do you think that there's a potential for there to be anything really important in there?
There is, because we know I have to be careful what I'm going to say here. The people with whom I am working, based on intelligence that we have provided, have allowed him and key people in the administration to get access to that, as well as to materiel. We're talking about spacecraft and craft. Now, how much of that is disclosed and to what detail and what part of the narrative? Or is it going to be another Project Blue Book thing, where it's just sort of window dressing, and then let's move on? I think this is an open debate. Now, I think last Friday, or a few days ago, actually, he was at giving a lecture in Phoenix at that Turning Point conference, and he that the UFOs, because they were supernatural, were therefore from Satan and were a trick and a deception, and that it was a supernatural and therefore demonic. And, I was talking to Monsignor Balducci, and he bursts out laughing, and he goes, neither, and interestingly, his specialty was demonology. Believe it or not, he was a demonology expert at the Vatican. And he says, neither demons nor angels need flying saucers. He just put it so simply. But I think the other problem, and this is something we're going to try to address briefly at the National Press Club, is that, man, if you went back and showed Thomas Jefferson, whose home is down the road here, this, and you had someone talking to you on this screen, there's a person in a box. It's sorcery. It's supernatural. A priori, it's demonic. This, to Thomas Jefferson, or not him probably, but in Salem, Massachusetts, you would be burned at the stake as a witch for having something like an iPhone or a smartphone. So I think we have to have enough humility to realize that, we're only, in terms of any real technology, 100, 150 years out of the jungle. And we're dealing with civilizations that are hundreds of thousands, some of them millions of years more advanced. All of their technology is going to look like magic to us. And therefore, if you're hyper religious in that way, it's supernatural, and therefore it's demonic. Well, this is a completely ridiculous and backward way of thinking about it. And we have to correct that, because the last thing we need is the United States of America, with someone a heartbeat away from the Oval Office, saying things like this about something that's important to national security.
Yeah, it is a bit odd, the religious overtones that you hear, even from people like, you mentioned J.D. Vance referring to these as demonic. Anna Paulina Luna has said similar things.
Oh, yes.
Tucker Carlson is all over the media talking about demons and angels and things like that. Right. It all does seem like very, very old-fashioned in a way. But
it's very ignorant, but it's also part of an agenda.
Well, this is what I want to get into. Like, the conspiracy theory is that they're gearing up for to frame this as some sort of like holy war.
Correct. And there are people in the Pentagon, CIA, FBI, NSA, all the three-letter agencies that represent that strain of thinking. And we've known about this for 30-some years. It's been around before that, before I walked on the stage of this issue. And I think that, to give you an idea how weird that thinking is, in July of 1994, I had a meeting with the Crown Prince of Liechtenstein, Prince Hans Adam von Liechtenstein, at the Pierre Four Seasons Hotel in New York City, there at Central Park, and on Fifth Avenue. And it was a very long 3-4 hour meeting. And he explained that he was part of this Opus Dei group at the Vatican that was very, very believed in that. And he said the reason Prince Hans Adam von Liechtenstein, was funding the abduction researchers and the mutilation researchers, et cetera, is that he wanted the public to be convinced that the aliens were from Satan and that we should have an interplanetary holy war that would force the return of Christ. And that if the world could be destroyed, sort of this final Armageddon type scenario, that Christ would return. And he explained this to me in great detail. Of course, I was only 4 years in by being involved with this. And I was sort of, at first I thought, you must be kidding, but he was not kidding. You embed in the sort of the public consciousness and subculture this idea of these horrific things being actually alien. So when you're a member of Congress new to this, like Congressman Burchett or Burleson or Luna or Rubio when he was co-chair of Senate Intelligence Committee, it's very easy to be gaslit and deceived by this because it's called stagecraft. The stagecraft is using very high-tech stuff that's extremely convincing to 99.999% of the population would say, that's an alien ship and that's an alien being, when it isn't. So many people say, oh, Dr. Rare, when are they going to start? When are they going to do this false flag operation? I said it started in the late 1950s, literally. And so that people don't want to hear that. They think that's bonkers. And I go, yeah, you can believe what you want, man, but I got the firsthand sources. So at the National Press Club, May 8th, stay tuned, because we're going to pull the curtain back on that freak show. And we're going to say, here's what's going on that people think are alien that aren't. Now, the reason that's so important is that if there is a disclosure, and it could be innocently done by Mr. Hegseth and Trump, that includes that information with the real information, they're all new to this. It could well be that they're not discerning the difference between the man-made staged events, which are psychological warfare operations, and the ones that are actual ET. The ones that are actual ET are completely I've led thousands of people out into the stars having contact for 36 years, since 1990. We have never been harmed. We've never been threatened, except by covert human programs that have done some nasty things to us. They attempted to abduct me the night I briefed and met with the Prince of Liechtenstein. They attempted to abduct me out of the St. Moritz Hotel on Central Park South. In fact, I don't talk about it much.
Wow.
And so I know exactly how they do it and what they do. And it was scary. It was scary. But luckily by then, this would have been in July of 94, I already had met people who had been operational in those programs that were staging these fake alien contact events. So I always tell people, the Disclosure Project is stepping into this with a full spectrum of information, but the bandwidth that Congress on this is actually very narrow. So I'm a little bit worried that have they done their homework, and we're going to find out, but I wouldn't take that what Mr. Burchett said he was referring necessarily to ET events. I think he was referring to these gruesome human experiments done by covert military operations. And some of it goes almost beyond the pale. I mean, if I were to tell everything I know, people wouldn't sleep tonight.
That makes sense.
Yeah. So, and imagine, one of the things everyone underestimates is the technology curve between 1940s and now.
Mm-hmm.
It started out slowly and then it went vertical. Reverse engineering, but not just propulsion and energy. We're talking, things that interface with consciousness and mind, weapon systems that are like the Havana syndrome, but on steroids. chemical systems that can cause hallucinations and experiences when people are being abducted and tortured. All kinds of genetic cloning and other experiments that have been done. I'll tell you that Dolly the sheep, the first cloned mammal, was not the first one. There were covert programs 30 years before that doing it with materials. And so it goes on and on. So this is one of the things, just for people who are interested in a really deep dive on this, about 2 or 3 weeks after the May 8th event in Washington at our retreat center out here in Virginia in the mountains, we're going to do a whole week where I'm going to do nothing but unpack my 65 years of experience with this phenomenon, start when I was a kid to now, but all of these deep dives into these covert places. And I've been in some of these facilities where they're doing this medical research because people know I'm a doctor, and they'll say, hey, doc, you'll understand this. And they'll tell me what they're doing with these genetic cloning things with extraterrestrial DNA and human DNA and coming up with this weird creature. And the ones that are more biological than robotic actually are biological. They're called programmed life forms, and they're a bio-nanotechnology, skull open. But they are grown. They are biological. And I know physicists and some other people who worked on those. And I know where they're doing it also, by the way. So these things have been used and set loose on the public. And then, of course, you can imagine if you're a new senator or congressman or president or national security advisor, and someone comes in from the Pentagon or CIA with a file of these horrific things, the sort of things that Gary Nolan's doing, where he's under contract for CIA to document brain injuries from alien encounters, but every one of those are actually human, fake alien encounters that are being handed off to him. So his tenured professorship at Stanford puts the imprimatur of credibility on something that's a complete hoax.
Does all of this speak to the theory about the human evolution, and that human DNA is a hybrid, essentially of some sort of ET beings?
Well, this gets into a bigger discussion. There was a group of computer programmers and analysts some years ago, maybe a decade ago, that analyzed the genome of Earth. And according to Darwinian, just random mutation, natural selection processes, there's only been life on Earth for 700 million years, and the Earth has been here about 4.5 billion. But they said that it would have to be about 4 or 5 billion years for the genome of what's on Earth genetically to have evolved through the current theories around natural selection and evolution. And we also know that, although we have 98% identical DNA with chimpanzees, that 2% and how it evolved, there's a gap in terms of time. So it's very likely that life on Earth, not just human, is we're all sort of descendants of a cosmic primogenitor, right?
Right.
This doesn't vitiate at all or negate the existence of a supreme being or God or creator. It just means that whole process of evolution and creation is more complex, and the Earth is not just hermetically sealed off by itself forever. Right. And that, one of the things, if nothing else, that the Boogosphere is proving, that thing, we did the carbon dating on the organic resin type material that was in the portals around the center equator of it, and that it's 12,560 years old. 12,500 at the end of the last ice age, when some comet came in and boom, the whole diluvian flood stories. And that's how far they date back from. And this thing is anti-gravity, free energy. The micro CT we just did, there are no structures in there. It's all sort of like, it had to be like a plasma, a magnetized plasma, and thing was spinning 330 RPMs, levitating, moving for miles all around that area of Colombia, South America. And there's no fuel source. There's no nuclear energy in it because we've done the tests, and and this thing is amazing. And so that's why we're including it at the National Press Club and say, also, this thing's been around 12,560 years. Like little sheep being led to the slaughter and not having the courage to do the right thing. And doing the right thing does take courage. Now, if our leaders can't manifest it, let's hope and pray the masses do. Because let's not forget, going back to the civil rights movement in the South, where I grew up, I'm old enough to remember segregated water fountains at the Sears store where my father worked. Yeah, there was a colored and a white water fountain, which when I was 5 years old, I thought, wow, this is magical, weird. And I was going to go drink out of one. And a little old lady grabs me. I'm this little 4 or 5 year old boy. She says, no, you can't drink out of that one. And there was a line for the one for white people. I said, well, why? Is the water poison? And he says, no, it's like all the other water, but it's for colored people. I said, well, what difference does it make? Because my father was Cherokee, Native American. We didn't have that racist mindset at all. But I realized as a little boy how people get into these weird belief systems that end up, in psychiatry, it used to be called super system trapping. Racism, the isms, and political parties and organized religion, for the most part, devolved that it shouldn't. So it breaks down into that due to demagoguery and ignorance. But I think that this is where we have to go, okay, we're going to have to manifest the courage to do this properly, either now or later. It's better we do it now before all this comes to a head. And that includes being somewhat activist with our fellow neighbors, but also with our leaders. And I've heard from so many senators and members of Congress who say, we really need to hear from our constituents on this because we're going out on a limb dealing with this thing, this issue. And yet the public tends to be very passive now. We need to create more where people send them our link, send them the briefing document. Get one and mail it to your member of Congress, right? I mean, do something. So I can only do so much as one man sitting up here, but I think that if more people were to take this under their wings and do the right thing, this problem would be solved.
I feel like we need to put I want to see if we can put some sort of phone number or website where people can go, probably your website, but also so you can figure out who to call to make it as simple for our audience as possible. I want to end this, get a few last things, then we're going to wind this down, but I want to project that new reality for people. What can you tell us about free energy technology? How is it best to come out? Because if I think of a people who are, well, I heard today, bomb them back to the Stone Age. If I think of giving free energy to everyone at this point, that seems a little bit scary. How does this come out? What's the future we can project to create? And what does it look like when we start to get this technology?
Well, the first thing, we have to disclose the information and technology first. And so people understand